Hello. 1945 was a traumatic year in the course of world history and in the course of the Pacific War. This is a profound year where many of the casualties of the Second World War will occur all over the world, where you will have millions homeless in Europe, stateless actors, nations, right? Collapsing, right? Germany imploding, Soviet Union moving forward, the Allies moving forward all together, and utter violence all over. As it relates to the Pacific War, you've got Allied forces led by the Americans approaching mainland Japan and going to engage in battles on Japanese soil in early and mid 1945. The engagements at Iwo Jima and Okinawa will, of course, demonstrate great sacrifice on the part of those who are fighting in them, but also any number of questions as to the future status of the war. At Iwo Jima, questions of the importance of the objectives there. Now, of course, often when we think of Iwo Jima, if we think of it at all, might be the flag raising on Mount Suribachi and this kind of thing, or the John Wayne film Sands of Iwo Jima or something like that. But the violence there, the violence especially at Okinawa, is ratcheting up. The casualty rates for the Americans are ratcheting up. Okinawa being the scene of Hacksaw Ridge and of the heroics of Desmond Doss, who would eventually win the Medal of Honor, and a number of Medal of Honors are awarded for actions on Okinawa. It's the era of the death of Ernie Pyle. It's the era of kamikaze attacks continuing. And it's a time period in which the Americans are starting to contemplate what to do. Now, we know the final result. Atomic bombs are dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, August 6th, August 9th. Eventually, Japan surrenders, but there's a lot wrapped up in that. For instance, the process of developing atomic weaponry. This is a process that would take us back through the 1930s, the early 1940s. The investigations done at the University of Chicago to make this actionable. The broader Manhattan Project run by J. Robert Oppenheimer. The fact that this was originally created to be used potentially against the Germans in Europe. And the eventual decision by the summer of 1945 with President Truman for these weapons to be used against the Japanese. And hitting cities with a knowledge that civilian casualties would be incredibly high. We don't really have a clear statement on the part of President Truman on the decision process. Truman going, I decided to do this because, and then getting into it. And so we have to then look to what are the factors that are around at that point that influenced the decision-making process, and what lessons can we learn from that with the realities of what happened. In the aftermath of World War II, you have some within the government who wrote letters and open articles stating that foremost on President Truman's mind at the time was the question of loss of life for the Americans. So the potential of an invasion. So the thought being that in order to end the war against Japan, you would need to invade the Japanese mainland, and that the functional result of that would be a casualty rate for the American soldiers doing it that Truman and others found to be unacceptable. In the 1960s, a number of historians in the 1970s began to suggest that it wasn't simply the question of casualties for the Americans. It was a function of political power. That 1945, Truman and others recognized clearly that in a post-war world, the Soviet Union was going to be a threat. So using these in an operational setting would demonstrate to the Soviets that the American ability to project force in a future conflict was real, and it might convince them to maybe acquiesce to American political demands in a post-war era. In the 1990s, scholars, Ronald Takaki notedly, so in the 1960s this was Gar Alperowitz and others. Ronald Takaki, in his work, he argued clearly that racialization played a central role, that casualty rates were actually projected casualty rates were actually quite low, and so Truman's decision to engage in this was racially motivated. Now, after Takaki, John Lynn, J. Samuel Walker, and some other historians have commented saying you have to look on what casualty rates, what projections, when they would have been given to the president or marshal, and actually the higher casualty rates were the real ones that the American military was expecting. Either way, the Americans become the first and only nation to release atomic weapons in combat. They are central to the process of bringing the war towards a conclusion, although there is a great deal of speculation of the war was going to be ending anyway, that all of that, right, there's that part of it too. Either way, the dropping of the atomic bombs, of course, was devastating. It had a horrific effect, especially on civilians within both Hiroshima and Nagasaki, not just in that moment, but of course for generations. And it's something that folks are still dealing with the effects of today. Now, after the surrender, I think it's good for us to look at the nature then of war, the nature of conflict, the nature of the decision to drop those bombs, recognizing that even at the end of the war, there's questions of post-war politics and power. And if anything, it demonstrates that the role of race in understanding calculus when it comes to war fighting matters, right? It's important for us to be able to recognize that. All right. Thanks so very much.